Yeah, that's great. Thanks, John.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thanks, Emma. I'm John Buttivant. I'm chair of the Severn Estuary Coastal Group and the Environment Agency's coastal engineer for the coastline on the English side of the Severn. I'll talk today briefly about shoreline management planning in England and Wales, its evolution, some of the next things that we need to be thinking about, and the future challenges that we are going to face as we move forward. Our coastal inheritance, there's a massive coastal inheritance in this country, and some fairly significant changes over time. 100 years plus ago, 150 years ago, very much the legacy was the coast being the beach. The Victorian traditional seaside resorts, day trips out started, people benefiting from the fresh air and realising how pleasant it was to spend time by the sea. Then, as we went through the late 30s and 1940s, we had the coast being defended against wartime threats, and then through the 1950s and 60s, quite a big transformation. There's big flooding on the east coast, in particular in 1953. Massive defences built at that time, and then and often very quickly. In the 1970s and 80s, we carried on a lot of that, very much the engineering our way out of a problem. Money was tight, and a lot of the defences are fairly utilitarian. As we went into the 1990s and 2000s, we started to get what's probably considered to be a more enlightened approach, looking at multifunctional flood and coastal risk management schemes, things that looked nice, places you wanted to be, and things that you could use, and things that deliver multiple benefits, whether it's for regeneration, redevelopment, or for the environment. It's no surprise to anyone, I think, here that one of the main driving forces for us is the storms and the sea and the risk of flooding, and certainly there's been a big history of that around the Severn Estuary, and the images below show the type of energy that we're dealing with when these big events happen. Coastal erosion, again, is nothing new. It's been ongoing for a long time, but there are some really difficult decisions ahead around what we can or can't protect, what's technically possible and economically feasible to protect, and the challenges of integrating the planning system such that we don't end up with places being built inappropriately. But that still leaves with a big legacy of existing properties and infrastructure that may be in at-risk areas. Within our wider coastline, the ports play a massive role in it. Not only are they big landowners, but in terms of the country and the economy, they're very, very important to us. We need to make sure that they continue to function, because clearly all of our goods and services that come in and out through them are vital to us as an island nation. There's also massive infrastructure in the coastal zone, and things like the M5 shown here, something that certainly, or the M4 crossings, things that you would want to be protecting. Numerous properties and urban settlements and rural settlements also within that coastal area. So lots there that we need to be thinking about and considering. We can't do any of that without thinking about the impacts on wildlife. And we heard yesterday about the work that's been going on in the Severn to allow the shad to be able to migrate upstream again and reproduce and hopefully produce a good fishery once again. The bird population is very, very important, and whether that's for high tide roosts or feeding grounds, but really, really important around the estuary in particular. We can't provide the habitats that are going to be required for those sorts of species without having the we can't provide those sorts of habitats if we were just to build solid concrete defences. So there needs to be space made for nature and to allow the habitats and the species that depend on them to thrive. We've seen in recent years a number of big storms and the impacts that those have. The Dawlish railway line in South Devon on the right-hand side in 2014, a massive storm, serious amounts of erosion and damage as a result. And the main road on the left at Slapton Line in South Devon again, which got completely covered and cut off in the same event. So in terms of the coastal risks in England and Wales, we've got a couple of million houses that are at risk from sea flooding and coastal erosion. That storm and the railway impacts in South Devon in 2014 left us with 1.2 billion of economic impacts as a result. Some 85% of all salt marsh has been lost since the 1850s, and that's obviously critical for the habitats. And we've got well over 1,000 known coastal landfill sites, and all the pollution and issues that might go with those when and if they become exposed. Dealing with that, there are some significant responsibilities that lie with a wide range of stakeholders, and therein in many ways lies much of the problem. All of these people have responsibility in one way or another for the coast, whether it's Welsh Government, the power stations, county councils, the ports, the district councils, landowners, National Trust, and the list goes on. So whether you're in England or Wales, all of those interests need to be considered within the coastal strip and what is going to be done about it. So when we're looking at planning the coastline, we need to be considering the natural environment. Clearly, very, very important, especially around the Severn Estuary and all the designations and all the interesting features that rely on that. To do that, we need to be very much aware of the natural processes, and indeed, to build traditional flood defences, you also need to be working with the natural processes where possible. There's limited funding available, and again, that whilst there is considerably more money, double the amount for this 6-year period in England, which is very welcome over the 6-year period, there's still not going to be enough money available, and we still need to get in partnership funding contributions. The costs and benefits for any national prioritisation will always be tricky to make schemes stack up, and we need to work hard with those. The communities themselves, we need to understand their requirements, their needs, and try to work with them where we can. And we need to make sure that we're involving them in the decision-making process. Local businesses, again, very important. The external funding, as I've mentioned, is really key, but tying that up and getting it available at the time when we're ready to build a scheme or getting our money ready to work with those other stakeholders is always going to be a challenge, and one that we're going to face increasingly in the coming years. And we heard yesterday a lot around adaptation and the need for that in the future. And that's certainly something very much that we will be working towards with the shoreline management planning process. So shoreline management planning is nothing new. It was a concept for England and Wales that was introduced by the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food in the early 1990s. And some 49 different shoreline management plans were developed at that time by the newly established coastal groups, which effectively consisted of the marine local authorities and one or two other main stakeholders. There was guidance which covered the whole of England and Wales, and it's in the pre-devolution days, and they produced some very useful documents. But as with all these things, it was the Mark I, and clearly there were lessons to be learned. In terms of where the shoreline management plans fit, they are non-statutory, which in some ways is good, but in other ways provides us with challenges, and we have to make sure that they are properly integrated into the wider planning processes. They identify policies to manage the erosion and flood risk. They provide evidence based on that we can base decisions on, which consider coastal processes. It considers the economic justification. It considers the habitat. We need to think about that natural environment and the sustainability of our defences. Think about the built environment, both what's there now and what's proposed for the future. And we need to try and comply with legislation. In terms of the sort of process, in theory, it's very simple. The shoreline management plan sets out the policies. The coastal defence strategy would sit normally underneath that and have some further detail and information about what it is that we're trying to do, when we're doing it and how we might do it, and the economic justifications for it. And then off the back of the strategy, you build the schemes and to build the individual defences or structures at the appropriate times. But hidden within that are numerous other policies and plans, whether they're local plans, marine plan, or a whole range of other plans and strategies that other organisations have. And as far as schemes go, again, we might have what we think is an idea for a scheme that seems to make sense to us, but there may well be other local needs that need to be considered. So although our process in theory is quite simple, it needs to be seen in a much wider context. In terms of what policies the SNP produces, we have hold the existing defence line, advance the existing defence line, manage realignment or no active intervention, and all of those over 3 different time epochs. As things stand at the moment, the hold the existing defence line is usually seen as being a good thing for defending the community, but all that's doing is suggesting to hold the line. It's not necessarily going to suggest that you can or could or should, or that there's the money there to allow the defences to be improved. And with the challenges of climate change and increased storminess potentially in the future, clearly we need to make sure that there are opportunities where needed to increase the protection offered by the defences as well. The second generation of shoreline management plans, effectively the ones that are currently in force and we're using, were developed between 2006 and 2012. They are rather more strategic than the original ones. There's only 22 of them this time round, and they cover the whole of the England and Wales coastline again. There were a few pilots that were taken up initially, which provided a lot of useful information and helped form the guidance. But they still remain non-statutory and they're not development plans, but we did generate them with much greater local planner input at the time. And certainly that's where we would expect to see many of the links now to them in the wider public domain. Those SNPs now are 10 years old from when we produced them, and much of the data in them is 10 years or so on as well, or further 10 years on, so much of the data may be 20 years or more old that they're based on. Having discussed within the coastal group chairs nationally and other key stakeholders, we felt actually the SNPs were basically sound. There's a lot of new evidence and they could do with refreshing to take that into account, whether that's climate change information, improved modelling, government strategies and other things that have come along in the meantime. But they were basically sound. The feeling was that the situation was the same in England and Wales, but DEFRA were in a position to take forward the refresh for the English side. Wales are now following with that, but they are probably 18 months or so behind the English part of the process. For me, as the Severn Estuary coastal group chair, that gives me some real concerns because potentially we have almost a 2-stage SNP. We'll have better information on one side of it than the other. So I'm really, really pleased and grateful that the Welsh government has found some money, and then RW are taking forward the refresh on the Welsh side to bring that in line with the work that we've done in England. It really isn't SNP3, it is just an update of what we had, and it's a great way of getting the right people back around the table again to discuss and build on what we've had previously. Really, the coastline, as we all know, is right on the front line of the climate and ecological emergency that's been announced by numerous local authorities around the estuary. So it's very, very important and very timely, really, especially with the recent discussions around adaptation and green-blue recovery and many of the discussions, again, that went on yesterday. In terms of the SNP refresh itself, what are we trying to achieve? We want a technically reliable shoreline management planning system. We want the right information there, and it needs to have a coherent relationship between the strategies of Welsh Government, of DEFRA, Environment Agency, NRW and others, and a clear line of sight down to the sort of policy level and the delivery of that policy. They must be more accessible and consistent, and the content better understood and better shared. At the moment, many of the SNPs are not easy to find. And when you do find them, you're very conscious that it's a document written 10, 20 years ago. And if you just want an overview, it's very difficult to get it. There's a lot of information there, but there's also a lot of technical information. We need to make sure that the governance is in place to maintain the plans into the future and the long term, and the resources to support that. But the ownership of that plan really does remain with the coastal group, and any decisions ultimately that are made around changes to policy or refinement of those policies will sit firmly with the coastal group. In terms of making it more accessible, the SNP Explorer is something that has been worked on with the Northwest Coastal Group, the other cross-border group in North Wales, and they've developed a prototype as part of phase 1 of the refresh process. The idea is that will be improved and rolled out nationally over the next couple of years, and that will be part of a way of improving our communications, awareness, and the accessibility of the data, and it will allow you to get in a sort of smartphone friendly format. It will allow you to see what the policies are, what the sort of key issues are, and then you can dive into the data behind that in the future. But as I say, that is only going to be part of the process going forward. In terms of some of the challenges that we've got, and they really will be quite significant in some areas. This is just one example from my area, but you can see the flood risk area here in blue extends right back and beyond the motorway. So with climate change, it's a massive potential risk area. We've also got 3 discrete or different networks of defences that protect it. There's the Congress Rio banks going up towards Clevedon at this end. You've got the Sand Bay dunes and defences, and the recharged beach out in Sand Bay here, and then Western Supermare, you've got the hard defences down to the south here, and then the sand dune system down towards Uphill. All of those features all protect this much wider area inland. So we need to think very carefully, if we're doing work on any one of those defences, how it fits. There's no point in just maintaining one and not maintaining the others, because as part of that wider system, the whole area remains at risk. So there's real challenges there in terms of delivery, thinking about the economic benefits, scheduling of the work and timing, so that we've got the money available and we've got the right things in place to provide the right level of protection at the right time. There are issues with planning. Again, the sorts of things that hopefully more discussion with the planners will avoid. This is one example locally to me where the local plan has identified within the plan for long-term mixed allocation, and in this case you've got the coastal road running along the front here and significant coastal erosion happening all down the front. The impact of this is quite visible when you see the predicted lines for coastal erosion. In 100 years time, we may well be back, if the prediction is anything like correct, back to this line. That's the road, and of course the whole of this area was allocated for development. So there needs to be a much closer join up between the planning system and the shoreline management knowledge. We've got massive opportunities for habitat creation and development around the Severn, but we need to understand what we're trying to achieve and where, and we need to put the right things in the right place, and we need to make sure they work as a functional habitat. Many of the schemes like this one at Steert or could be multifunctional. Certainly at Steert, massive creation of intertidal habitat, fantastic site for bird breeding. It's provided the community with some greater protection than they had before, and it's really been a very, very good scheme. Schemes on this scale are few and far between, but there are probably a number of examples where we could and should be looking to do other things locally. We also need to be very aware going forward of other people's agendas, and we heard again yesterday, and we've heard in previous forums about potentials for power generation within the estuary and other big schemes that might go on at different times. And any of those, if they go in, certainly any of the big schemes that will fundamentally change patterns of erosion, deposition, they could well affect our defences. They may well also affect the tidal range, and whilst you think it doesn't matter so much if the tide doesn't go out so far effectively because it's been held up behind some sort of structure, it does have a knock-on impact both for the intertidal habitats and for the land drainage for some of the low-lying areas. And again, thinking about the Gwent levels in particular from yesterday's discussion. So we need to work very closely with those sorts of organisations, and they need to understand the wider impacts as well of their work, as well as some of the benefits. But there's certainly impacts for the ports, which will be really significant. There's impacts for if you're taking the energy out of the system and slowing down the water as it moves through, you won't have that distinctive brown soupy water that everyone associates with the Severn. But that material will have to fall out somewhere. So where does it fall out, and what's the impact of that when it does fall out, both on wildlife and on flood risk and other features? So a few final closing thoughts. Real life never does respect your plans. You can plan all you like, but other things come along, developments, weather events, whatever it is, and you have to work with those. The SMP is good. It comes with some really sound data. It's going to be even better once we've gone through the full refresh process, but we need to use it. We need to keep it up to date, and that's going to be a real challenge, and we need to make it more accessible. Adaptation will be really, really important as we go forward, and that flexibility to deal with the things that don't quite go in line with the plan will also need to be considered. The opportunities, the working with others, the making things happen. Placemaking offers a real opportunity for us, working with the much broader community to understand what other things could be aligned with flood risk management. And again, we'll see potentially some of those, I think, in the discussion about Bristol a bit later on today. But there's a real challenge in that and how we align our agendas. How we fund schemes, particularly no active intervention, which doesn't mean no money needs to be spent, because often you need to make safe the defences, or you need to do other remedial work to other bits of infrastructure to make sure that they are safe and functional, even once the defences are gone or not functioning as they currently do. Hold the line sounds easy to say, but again, in many cases requires some really significant funding, and there are numerous challenges there. Coastal squeeze versus functioning habitat, how we take that forward. We need to think really carefully about the impact of that over in the future, and we need to make sure that what habitat we put back functions for the purposes that it's needed and is not is properly thought through and part of an integrated programme. We need to ensure the SMPs are integrated with the planning system, and not just the terrestrial planning, but marine plans and other documents that are around flood risk management plans, and that it's clear how they fit and exactly the hierarchy that things work in. And finally, communication, really, really important. The number of communities that are affected, businesses that might be affected in the future, some that are affected now. How do we do that as a group of coastal practitioners? It's a real challenge, and we need to understand what the communities want to help get to the right solution, and to work with them for those solutions. But they also need to understand the risk and how we can help them and how we can work together, or where potentially in some cases we're not going to be able to help them directly. So it's about how we help them to adapt and move and adapt to a new normal. That's it for me for this session. Thank you very much for listening. And any questions, please add them to the chat in the usual way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. We are a little bit over on time, so I'm not going to ask you any questions right now, but I'll keep them for the discussion. There are some coming in, so please do continue to add them, and we'll make sure that we pose them to John at the end in the discussion panel.